The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we welcome guest Tony Cupido. As Mohawk College's Research Chair, Sustainable Building Technologies, Tony undertakes leading-edge research that will contribute to a low-carbon economy, while engaging students to develop a multidisciplinary focus on finding real-world solutions to social, economic, and environmental challenges. His research initiatives include the development of an operational performance database for Canada's award-winning, largest institutional, net zero energy and zero carbon building, the Joyce Centre. Currently, he is working on the measurement and validation of innovative air purification and ventilation improvement technologies used in Ontario schools. Tony is on the board of directors for the Canada Green Building Council, representing academia and research across Canada. He is also an adjunct associate professor at McMaster University's Walter G. Booth School of Engineering Practice and Technology. Now let's get into the episode with Tony. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Lysandra. And looks like we're missing our colleague, John Pooley from the UK today.
Yes, we are. Hopefully we have him back next week.
Yes, for sure.
Today we are joined by guest Tony Cupido. Welcome, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to create this podcast for everyone.
I would like to let our listeners be aware that we have been working in collaboration and talking with Mohawk College on many fronts. Tony has been a key person that we've worked with. So I think this session will be really informative for our listeners. I hope they'll find that as we go forward.
Thanks for that, Dave. I'm also very excited for this episode. This is a realm that we haven't addressed yet on this podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about building a zero emission building. And to kind of start that in, what is a zero emission building?
Well, let me start with that, Sandra. It's a term that's being used a lot now, and it can be interpreted as a zero carbon emission building. It's often called that. But what it is, in its simplicity, it's a very highly efficient energy building. It uses only renewable energy. That's a standard approach. The fundamentals of it are that not use natural gas for the building heating purposes. And that's something that needs to be recognized. You need to heat the building, but natural gas is not what you should be using.
Tony, question for myself. Can you tell the audience, is zero emission buildings actually achievable?
Dave, they are. I think what has to be understood is that zero emission buildings and even highly energy efficient buildings need to be rated or perceived over a period of time. At any moment in time, you can't necessarily say that a building is zero emission because there's factors that go into how one would rate that. And without getting too technical on it, we live in a climate where at this time of the year, it's pretty cold. PV generation for electrical purposes is at its lowest point in terms of generation over a period of time. So at any moment in time, sometimes these zero emission buildings need a little bit of a boost, what I call a boost, to keep them that way. But over a period of a year, I always remind my students of this, or remind everybody I can when I talk about it. You need to judge these buildings over a period of a year. And I'll use an analogy. Sometimes you have a great car and it performs very well, even if it's an electric vehicle and you like the performance, measure in the winter. It performs differently. Don't have snow tires. Sometimes it's not the easiest thing to drive around, all that. But having said that, the purpose is you have that type of a vehicle to help promote the environment and a lot of different things. So they are achievable. They need to be considered over that period of time. There are many examples of that. I think not only in practice, and we have the Joyce Centre at Mohawk College here in Hamilton, which is a zero emission building. And we're very proud of that, zero carbon certified building. We'll talk about some of that in a minute, but they can be built. Now we need to consider how other residential, commercial, and institutional buildings can be built, because there's new buildings to consider. And then there's retrofits, which is a whole other world. And retrofits of existing buildings to help them become zero emission can be achieved. They have been achieved, but it is a bit more of a daunting task from a technical point of view. And you need some financial consideration to make sure that those numbers work. Good work that's being done by many organizations like the Canada Building Council and Passive House Canada can demonstrate that it can financially be done, but it needs to be put into a context of a cost as any commercial or larger institutional or residential complex needs to be.
That's great information, Tony. Maybe just for our listeners, can you tell them why zero emission buildings are so important going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. I think in the broader context of our country and then looking more at the broader of the Paris Accord, the need to look at cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings are a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Figures vary depending on what you get, but 30 to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions can come from buildings and then all the related pieces that go with that. So in the operation of those, particularly in our climate, where we need a lot of heating and natural gas consumption to help achieve that, typically, we need to, do better. And we need to understand that there isn't a better way from a technical point of view and from a practical point to construct these buildings and operate them so that they become zero emission or close to as zero emission as possible. There will be circumstances where that's very difficult to achieve, perhaps on many retrofits. But having said that, going the longer way to achieving the goal of reducing those emissions will help. Now, when that happens, occupants understand it, operators understand it, and I think many individuals, and we're seeing this even with our students in law college, their lifestyle tends to want to embrace what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. Now, I know the last couple of years have been a challenge. A lot of people haven't been on campuses or to their offices or otherwise. But we were operating fully that first year. People, they embrace what they're learning into that building, lecture halls, and being in it to socialize or otherwise helps promote and foster a belief that we can do better in our environment and that the school they're at is promoting and demonstrating that. Their instructors are doing that in that case. The library and all the circumstances that go in that area are helping to promote that. So you need to foster that. We call that some cultural change that's necessary. So you can imagine if you're going to an office tower in Toronto, like many people did day after day, and that is a better environmental point of view as it relates to carbon and carbon reduction. People will have that feeling. The company will have that feeling that they're renting this or being in the space, or the company that's renting the space will help promote that as well. So it's taking time. It may take a couple decades. I say a generation for all this turns over, but we've started that already. And we're seeing it in our case, young individuals are coming to learn about all this. And we're seeing it in early days with many organizations who are now working with all sorts of different levels of government and businesses and associations to help promote zero emission buildings. And we're seeing some good progress.
It's interesting, Tony, because not only this is an academia thought process, you actually have experience actually building these buildings with the work that you've done in Mohawk, and you continue to actually engage with other organizations to do that. So can you explain how a zero emission building is built for our listeners?
Yeah, I'd love to, Dave. Yeah, and we're very proud at Mohawk College that we have one of the first institutional, large-scale, dual certified under the Canada Green Building Council, zero carbon building, which translates into zero emission for the purposes of what we're talking about. We started this journey in 2016. It seems like a long time ago, but I remember like yesterday just going over some planning of it. But there was an opportunity at Mohawk to receive a significant federal grant to help with putting up a new building. And we, along with other institutions across Canada, primarily universities and colleges, we made an application. When we were making and developing that application, one of the clear objectives was, and I credit our president, Ron McCurley, for pulling this out, what can we do to differentiate ourselves from all the other institutions? And I had no hesitation in saying, because these were early days for me and wanting to do some good things here, let's make this a net zero building. And those were the simple terms then, net zero. It was primarily energy at that point. I had to explain to our president what that meant. But very it was understood that no one else was doing this. And in doing that, we received a grant of $20 million from what's called the Strategic Infrastructure Fund, which was a significant amount of money. I had many colleagues at much larger institutions, including U of T and others, who gave me some nasty calls and some pokes. And we were together at some of our meetings. How the heck did you do this? Well, because we put together a very compelling case of wanting to make a difference as it related to new building structures. And we did this with a net zero building. Now, having said that, almost concurrently, the Canada Green Building Council, which I'm proudly affiliated with as a member of the board of directors, they were coming out with a pilot program. It's called their Zero Carbon Building Program. And they said, look, we need 16 participants across the country, all sorts of varying participants, small, large, private sector, public sector. We think your building would be an ideal candidate. Would you like to participate? Absolutely, everybody is on board with this. So we, as a participant for a pilot project at the time, helped demonstrate, along with some others, demonstrate that this can be achieved and get third-party recognition. Because it's easy to say that you do have a highly efficient building and that you have this. Okay, well, do you have some type of validation for that? And that's important to say. And we were able to use the framework that the Canada Building Council had. We were the first to gain a zero carbon design certification. It's 2 steps: design, and then after a year of performance, zero carbon building performance certification. We recently just completed our 2nd year of the performance certification process. It has to be done annually. And we're very proud to say that we met all the metrics that allow us to proudly say that we have a zero emission, zero carbon building here at Mohawk College. And as Dave knows, because you've had, Dave, the pleasure of touring through there, we've had literally thousands of people tour that building from all parts of the world to see how a zero carbon building can be built, for sure, and then understand how it was designed. And I've done the majority of those tours, and I'm very proud to do it. It's a learning opportunity. The key thing now is we're helping students embrace this with learning opportunities. Again, the last couple of years have been a bit of a quirky piece, and even for many of the office towers, even in Toronto, who are looking at their operations the last couple of years and all the things that go with it, the metrics are all out of skew, right? So we're getting back to normal, but the performance, having said that, you still have photovoltaic pieces there because you need renewable energy. You still have to heat and cool the building to a certain extent. All those metrics were still in place. We're still doing some research on the building, even whether it's water conservation and distribution throughout the building. We're doing some studies on that. So we were able to demonstrate it. We were able to get it third party. It's very important. We were able to share that information technically and informally to people who wanted to tour the building. And we're seeing the benefits of that. I'm still getting calls, I would say, on a weekly basis from some architectural firm or a group who says, hey, how did you do this? What were some of the, takeaways from the building? Any pros and cons? What would you recommend? What's your approach? And I'm happy to share that, because what we want to do is promote how we can do this and how it can be achieved.
Tony, so many great points so far in this episode. I find the Mohawk College zero emission building a great example. And I think because as a student, I see how my peers typically behave on campus versus, how individuals behave in a workplace. And I would say if a campus building can be treated with that respect and actually, be able to perform as a zero emission building, I think it's a good example to see that it is able to go into the workplace as well. Kind of just thinking, people typically work at a company for multiple years. It's basically their second home. So they would treat it with the utmost respect. And I think that comes into play. And I'm sure we will address that in our next episode when we discuss operating a zero emission building as well.
Yeah, well, good point. And just if I could add something else too, we demonstrated to everyone that we could plan, design, construct, and operate this building at no additional cost to a typical institutional building across Canada. We have a lot of data on that. And we're very proud to say that because people say, well, these things always cost more. And that's one of the downsides to even looking at this. And we simply said for new building construction, absolutely not. There's lots of reasons for that. Perhaps we'll get into those, but primarily because of the reduced mechanical systems that are in the building and how straightforward and simplistic they are in their functionality. That's what helps with the cost of it. So retrofits are a little different. They're all unique. You have to look at that and see if we can improve the approaches there. But certainly from a cost perspective, they fit right in with other buildings. So that's a good thing.
It's so interesting, Tony, because we hear often the client's perception that doing this activity, it will cost a lot more money. And it doesn't matter what they do. They always think, oh, because it's so new, it's going to cost. And you've kind of given an example in your situation. Actually, it didn't cost more money. So it's nice to hear that from your point of view, because we are always telling people that this doesn't need to cost more money. In fact, it might even be not only might be the same cost or lower capital cost, but the operating cost could be lower as well. We'll get into that. So question, and you may have said it, but I broke up. Is there a certification given for the building that you have that you require or that you undertake for this?
Yes. If someone is seeking certification, there's a couple approaches to take here. The one I'm most commonly familiar with, and again, because of my background with the Canadian Building Council, they have a zero carbon building program. So there's a process to go through to have your building designed as a zero carbon, zero emission building, and then quantified and justified as in the performance of that building to ensure that it was put up that way. So Canada Building Council's program has a zero carbon building design certification, which we achieved at the early stages. And then after a year of operation, we achieved a zero carbon building performance certification. So there's some metrics that go with that. It's not an overly complex process to go through. Most of the architects and engineers who are familiar with this, and particularly energy consultants who really have to produce all the numbers that go with this. We're very familiar with the process. Much of the numbers were in those anyways that were produced for the building, set with targets and that. But the actual concept of it is straightforward. So it's very achievable. I would say it's even more easily achievable from a dynamics and data point of view than actual LEED certification, if it's familiar with LEED certification for buildings, which can sometimes be a little cumbersome because of all the processes you have to go through. And that there are some costs with that, and I understand the challenges with it. The zero carbon piece was good. So it was something that was achievable. We were the first in Canada, even part pilot or any other building, to achieve the zero carbon design and performance certification. So we're very, very proud of that. And it also provided data for us that we could have that we could easily share. People looking for information on how that's achieved, it's easily shareable.
Now, Tony, this is a follow-up question, which you may not know was going to come at you, but just as you're talking, last podcast, couple of podcasts, we've talked about carbon offsets and credits and things of that nature. With the fact that your building's certified, do you have the ability of actually selling credits based on your reduction of carbon? Is that something available for zero emission buildings?
Yeah, it is. It isn't something we've considered. Part of it is the building is part of a complex. So we've been asked a couple of things. One is about carbon credits. One is about selling energy back to the grid if there's an opportunity. The building is a important and integral piece of a larger campus setting. So we have about 1.5 million square feet on our final campus where it is. And it's a building that's interconnected into that. And so this building's about 97,000 square feet. So we consider that building as integral part of the grid on our campus. So we don't sell anything back, and we have surplus energy. And you can imagine in the summer, when it's the best production opportunity and typically the lowest student occupancy, we have more than enough power that the building needs. And we just simply use that on other parts of the campus. In fact, we're doing that quite a bit over the last couple of years. That building alone and all the solar panels that were associated with the building actually powered about 3/4 of the entire campus when there were no students on there in the summer because it was such a little draw. But then the carbon piece to that, we just left it intact. There are the whole issue of carbon credits, how those are attributed is a science in itself, and it's a bit of a marketing piece in itself. There's opportunity there, but we chose not to get into quote the marketplace, but to manage that internally.
Okay. Last question from me. You talked about, new buildings and retrofits, and, there's a large retrofit marketplace. You conveyed that it's challenging and more difficult, but is that a marketplace that can and will be looked at going forward, Tony?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. And the answer is yes, it is at early stages, and it certainly will be. And the reason it will be is something that I think is becoming more of an issue of governance, what I call governance policy. Many large municipalities, and Canada, I'll start with Vancouver for one, maybe a leading municipality, and then Toronto, and then some others, have set up planning and code compliance requirements for people with new buildings and retrofits to comply with over the next period of years. You simply can't go in to, particularly Vancouver, you're a developer, and put up a energy, would call it energy sloppy building. It has to meet certain standards and criteria that not only comply with the national building codes, but exceed that. They have their own codes locally that are requiring much higher standards. In fact, many places are now requiring zero emission buildings 2030 or 2035. It depends on a number of factors. Toronto is moving in that direction. Many individual states and cities in the United States are moving that way. New York has been a leader in that. California, of course, has been doing it for years, but given the complexity in such a large environment like New York State, they are kind of front runners when it comes to certain building standards and requirements. And we're happy to see that. So that's where I think that's where I would be saying is you as a building developer and an individual or group as a building renewal requirement, which we figure out roughly every 25 years, somebody has to do some significant renewal on a building. We'll have to meet certain standards of energy use, meeting specific targets, particularly not only for energy, but certainly for carbon reduction as well. So regardless of what these building owners want, they will be compelled to do that. Now, what we are seeing in early days is we know in new buildings, when you put it up, running a zero emissions building, people like what they feel. The occupants like what they feel. In a lot of early indications for some zero, and we know there are some zero energy, zero emission condos, for example, that are coming up and are just opening up. The occupants are finding their carrying costs, their monthly carrying costs are so small. They're below $100 in some cases. Why? Because the energy consumption in the building is extremely low and very efficient. And that's what I think there'll be a demand for this. I think just as you're seeing in itself, because I have an electric vehicle, but the EV market, the manufacturers saw the potential here. The owners and people who have driven cars know the comfort and the performance and a lot of things that you can achieve in an electric vehicle, and a lot of people want to move in that direction. So it's the the pent up demand that will, I think, from the marketplace or otherwise, which will spearhead a lot of this, let alone the governance policy and code issues that will help oversee it all.
Tony, you mentioned so many great points throughout this episode. I'm kind of curious. A lot of our listeners are from the private sector. So is there funding for private sector to become a zero emission building? And is there opportunities to work with academia to achieve this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't say there's funding. There are some rebate opportunities and credits you can get from some municipalities and their energy providers offer some opportunity locally to access some grant monies to assist you with this, whether it's through the design or some of the performance characteristics of the building. But other than that, there is not a specific grant out there to. Now, if what I would be saying to private developers who are looking at the cost of the buildings from a new building perspective, I think the greatest appreciation will come from your operating costs, depending on your longer term objective, whether you're renting these facilities out, selling them individually, or selling space within them. The operating costs will be something that will be seen as the benefit. The operating costs of a zero emission building are certainly as good or much better than your typical building operation. And that goes from a maintenance perspective as well, which the maintenance of a lot of the equipment that goes into zero emission is nominal at best, as opposed to conventional systems which require monthly maintenance in many cases to make sure they're performing well and stuff like that. The the renovation piece, the renewal piece, something a little different. You have to take a harder economic look at what is involved with this. There are opportunities to do this, and the paybacks are becoming more realistic. There is some good data out there from the Canadian Building Council, which shows some return on investment statistics. There's still some work to be done. And I think as some of these systems get a little bit better and some of the opportunities are explored, if there's more people into that marketplace, it will happen in a better way. Toronto, for example, if they are tied to the deep water lake cooling system that many office towers in Toronto have, they're seeing now the true benefits of it. That, whatever it's 10, 15 years later, they're really appreciating that. Wow, this is a straightforward way to cool your building instead of bringing all the mechanical systems. I remind everybody that, and Dave will know this, one of the things that you need to really consider when you're weighing out the metrics and any return on your investment now, commodity prices are going to go through the roof in the next few years. We're seeing that already. Electrical costs are going up. Natural gas costs are going up as a commodity, which is basically given away almost the last few years. But when you layer on carbon taxes and other costs to that, it's going to go up considerably. Oil is very volatile. It's been at a low point for many years. It's even as of yesterday, it went up, spiked up again. People are going to see that in a much different way this summer as gasoline prices go else. But all those contribute to ongoing operating costs to operating your building. So commodity prices will be up, and water traditionally, I know in Hamilton, it's typically 6 to 8% a year. We don't talk about water enough. It's part of a zero emission building, but water, rainwater harvesting for purposes of flushing toilets primarily, and argue about drinking water, that's a little different piece, but certainly the bulk of it is for flushing toilets. And even with the disposal of that, there's some heat recovery opportunities. I know that's growing some interest, opportunities with using the warmth from the sewage system to help with reclaimed heat for your building. There's many ways that engineers and designers are starting to take advantage of what is naturally there to help them with operating a building. And I think as some developers have experienced in Toronto, some larger ones have done some major retrofits to get to the platinum roadways, it's been great. And they're pretty happy they've done it. And they're starting to spread the word. And I think you'll see more and more of this over time.
Thank you for joining us today, Tony. To end off our episode, what is the biggest takeaway from this episode for building or retrofitting a zero emission building?
Yeah, another great question. And here's what I would say is that certainly a zero emission building or a new building can be built. We demonstrated that now. It's 3 years ago, time it opened. We've demonstrated that. We've demonstrated that it performs that way properly. It can be done. Many of my colleagues are also doing the same. We haven't got into some different design construction options with wood and timber buildings, but that is becoming an important piece in the zero emission, zero carbon structure and framework of buildings, especially as it relates to embodied carbon, which is a whole other topic. But it can be done. Renewal, we're demonstrating with a lot of data that it can be achieved. It's usually on a per building basis, but we're demonstrating now that there are some reasonable returns on investment when you consider the whole picture about what should be done. And it's important to understand that there is now governance and policy and code compliance issues that are stretching across our country and in cases across individual states south of us that are compelling owners and developers of buildings to go in that direction. So as more momentum builds up, you'll see costs, I think, come down. You'll see compliance issues becoming more straightforward and desirable to achieve. And you need to know that we're a living example of that at College with the Joint Center. Very proud of that. And if anybody has an interest in understanding a little bit more detail about that, I'd be happy to share that with you.
Dave, any final comments?
I think just to reinforce what Tony was suggesting, it's doesn't mean it's going to be larger capital, and it certainly sounds like it's perhaps a lower operating cost. I don't think many people actually understand that. So what I think is required, and Tony's on this, obviously where he's located and the work he does, and hopefully the work we do going forward, is educating the marketplace that there is an opportunity and there's a business case. I mean, there's a business case to do this work. So I'm excited about the future. We just need to educate more people about the opportunity going forward.
I agree. Both of you bring up great points. I think it's also important to emphasize that although, the zero emission building at Mohawk College is a public sector, I believe that there's so many opportunities for the private sector to also build or retrofit their buildings to become a zero emission building. And I look forward to seeing the numbers of zero emission buildings in the next couple of years as well. All right. Thank you both for your time today.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. We look forward to the next part.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.